Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Sharon Ruston and I work in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University, and I'm going to be talking to you today about Shelley, particularly about his poem Ozymandias, but also I'm going to mention Ode to the West Wind as well. So, Shelley had been political throughout his life, despite the fact of his elite upbringing. He went to Eton and he was destined for a baronetcy, a hereditary title. He claimed that the bullying that he experienced at Eton made him first aware of man's tyranny of man. He only lasted 6 months at Oxford University. He was expelled after he and his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg wrote a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism and published it and sent it to all the leading religious figures in the country. So they expelled him. And that is quite ironic because there's a statue of Shelley in University College, Oxford, where he was for those 3 months, even though they expelled him. I think that's quite ironic given what I'm going to be saying about Ozymandias and how we can't control the way that we're thought of in death. So it's the same thing has definitely happened to Shelley. One of Shelley's earliest poems was an extremely political poem called Queen Mab, published in 1816. Which had long prose notes that covered philosophical, scientific and religious issues uncompromisingly. Perhaps most famously in this poem, he wrote that marriage was a form of prostitution. He declared his belief in free love and his anger at social injustice and the hypocrisy of religion. It was Queen Mab that was used to prove that Shelley was immoral, blasphemous and seditious when he applied for custody of his children with his first wife, Harriet, and which was denied to him for those reasons. He never saw those children again because of that. Anyone who knew Shelley in his lifetime and remember that he did not enjoy the popularity of Byron or Charlotte Smith or Felicia Hemans, other poets at the time, knew of him as a radical and a scandalous figure, having run off with his first wife, left her for Mary Shelley, and finally left England never to return because of debt and ill health. Sometime after he drowned at the age of 29, the myth-making began. While Shelley was taken up and used by Chartists, he was one of their most favourite poets in their cause. The middle-brow Victorians, such as Matthew Arnold, also tried to claim that his merits were not in his political writing, but in other more philosophical or abstract poems. So this is the myth-making about Shelley's life beginning. Arnold famously described Shelley as a beautiful and ineffectual angel beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. Arnold's comments on Shelley refused to acknowledge the politics of his poetry and instead think of him as a beautiful but ineffectual otherworldly being. And the same thing happened to Keats as well after his death. So many of Shelley's political poems weren't actually published during his lifetime, but much later. So I guess some people didn't know about them. But I'm going to look at 2 poems here that aren't always perhaps thought of as primarily political and see whether we can see the political Shelley there. Indeed, to briefly mention an early poem to Wordsworth, published in 1816. Shelley in that poem accused the earlier poet Wordsworth of having deserted songs consecrate to truth and liberty. By this time Wordsworth had accepted an official post as distributor of stamps for Westmoreland. He was a tax officer basically. And as far as Shelley was concerned, Wordsworth had gone over to the dark side. In the poem, Shelley grieves that Wordsworth and his poetry have changed. He wrote, "Thus having been that thou shouldst cease to be." So Shelley's here saying, it's such a shame you're not political any longer, which I guess makes us think again about Shelley's career and how he wouldn't have wanted to go that way himself. The poem Ozymandias then was composed in a light-hearted enough manner. It was written as part of a sonnet writing competition with his friend Horace Smith. The subject matter was topical because there had been news of an excavation of a statue of the head of Ramesses II, who was the 13th century BC king of Egypt. Ozymandias is the Greek name for Ramesses II. This would eventually be brought to the British Museum, and you can see it for yourself there now. Shelley hadn't seen this yet, but he imagines what it must have been like to have come across the broken bits of a colossal statue and reflect upon the nature of power and tyranny in relation to time. So now I want you to pause the lecture and to go off and to read the poem Ozymandias. Have a look at the rhymes at the ends of the lines, and try and work out the rhythm of the poem. Where do the stresses fall in the lines? Think about who is speaking and when they finish speaking, and how many people speak in the poem. So the poem is a sonnet, and it has a framing narrative. The I of the poem meets someone else who has seen the bits of broken statue in the desert. He describes how he sees two huge legs without a body still standing upright, and near these there's a half-sunk face, a visage, whose expression can still be seen, that frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command, that reveal the character of the tyrant Ozymandias. The fact that these features are still visible and identifiable also shows that the sculptor was good at his job. The sculptor read those passions of Ozymandias's well and expressed them in his sculpture well. In fact, because the sculptor's skill is what has survived, we understand that Ozymandias was a horrible man and a tyrant, because the sculptor was so good at portraying this. These passions have been stamped on the lifeless stone of the statue. Ozymandias must have commissioned this statue as a memorial to him. As becomes clear, he wanted people to fear him even after his death. It's unclear, though, whether the sculptor, in conveying the sneer of cold command, for instance, was acting on his own part or on the orders of Ozymandias. The hand that mocked them, i.e. the hand that has managed to imitate in rock the passions of the man, may be mocking in more ways than one. The sculptor may, indeed, have read those passions well, because he suffered under the tyranny of Ozymandias personally. The words on the pedestal reveal, in case we didn't already know, Ozymandias's hubris, his extreme pride and self-confidence. The irony is that there are only a few remnants left of the impressive statue that he left as a marker of his eminence. In fact, the sight of two giant trunkless legs might even strike you as quite funny when you think about it. There is further irony in Ozymandias's command that we look on his works when nothing beside remains. So Shelley reverses the metre here too. Where we become used to the iambic pentameter that is used in the sonnets, de-dum, 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 the word nothing is a trochee, so the stress falls on the first syllable. No thing, nothing. You wouldn't say nothing. The long vowel sounds and the alliteration in boundless and bare, with the open-ended vowel sounds of far away at the end of the poem, emphasise the fact that there is nothing now there. Ozymandias's works are long gone. Time has obliterated any power that he had. He is even potentially a figure of fun. And yet, there are bits of the statue still present, it's true, including significantly the facial expressions and the words on the pedestal. Are his words a message to would-be tyrants? What has happened to me will happen to you. Or does the poem make us realise that while Ozymandias might not be around anymore, tyranny still is, in ever new forms? The poem asks of us, what will survive? Tyranny or art? Is the fact that the statue has survived, and that it has such effect on the traveller and the narrator, the result of the artist's expertise? Is this a memorial to Ozymandias or to the unnamed sculptor? And if you're erring on the side of the sculptor, what then about the poet who has written the poem, Shelley himself? So I'm going to talk about Ode to the West Wind next, and talk about it in the same kind of ways, about legacy and memorial and those things. So pause the lecture now, and go away and read the poem, and then come back to me. So as you should be able to see by now, Shelley was out of step with his contemporary society. Declared blasphemous and seditious by the Lord Chancellor, he declared himself an atheist in a time when people were very religious, not to mention that he believed in free love, was anti-marriage, a vegetarian and a teetotaler. Shelley has understandably been portrayed as a prophet speaking for a future audience who was not understood by his contemporaries. Indeed, his poetry has been important not just for the Chartists or for the trade unions, but also in many other more recent contexts, including the recent Occupy movement. In his poem Ode to the West Wind, Shelley writes an invocation to the west wind, which is typified as an uncontrollable force, potentially both a destroyer and a preserver. He asks the wind to make him its lyre, in other words, to speak through him as the wind makes an Aeolian lyre its instrument. An Aeolian lyre was an instrument that you put on the windowsill, and as the wind came through the window, it would play the instrument. This is what it means to be a prophet, to give yourself up to a powerful force, often God, but importantly it's not God in Shelley's poems. And for that force to speak through you. Wind is often figured as a metaphorical symbol of inspiration. Shelley contrasts himself with the power of the wind. He is, quote, chained and bowed by time, when once he was, like the wind, tameless and swift and proud. And this can be seen too in the form of the poem, which uses something called terza rima, made famous in Dante's Divine Comedy. So pause now and go back to the poem and have a look at where the rhymes come in the poem. And so label them A, B, A, so you can see which lines rhyme with which lines. So the poem is composed of tercets, or 3-line stanzas, and the rhymes are A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, etc., so that the middle rhyme of the stanza is picked up by the next stanza, and so on. It has a kind of rolling effect, which you might liken to life itself, or to an uncontrollable moving force like the wind. Importantly, though, Shelley adapts this form in his poem. For example, this section has four 3-line stanzas of terza rima, and then it has a rhyming couplet, thus making sonnet-like sections of 14 lines. The rhyming couplet serves to complete and to halt the movement of the terza rima, perhaps showing that Shelley cannot, in the end, imitate the power of the west wind. The west wind has an important function in the poem, because in real life it picks up and carries the leaves and the winged seeds, transporting them from one place to another. This is crucial for the life of the seed. It needs to be moved to new ground to have any chance of life and survival. Shelley describes the way that these seeds lie cold and low, indistinguishable from dead things, until the spring comes and they come alive. He wants the wind to do the same thing to his words. The leaves can refer to the pages of the book too, which of course come from real trees themselves. Shelley asks the west wind to drive his words across the world and perhaps into another time and place where they will live and grow. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth, and by the incantation of this verse scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So this is the voice of a disillusioned poet. Unlike the earlier poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Shelley didn't have the optimism of the French Revolution to pin his hopes on. He had only the legacy of its failure and a more general hope that life would get better. Shelley's asking for his words to survive long enough to be received well and for them to achieve real change. He really did believe that poetry could change the world, and he hopes here that his words will do that. And here we are all discussing him 200 years after his death. The final statement is optimistic, of course, because spring always does follow winter. A better time will come. But then there is also that question mark. The way that Shelley has put this, if winter comes, can spring be far behind, leaves us to wonder whether this will happen in this instance. He's asking, will he live to see better times? And will he live to see his poetry understood and acted upon? Will better times ever actually come? That's it. Thank you very much.